The Journeyman, Chapter 2. Jared, riding off beside Mr. Toppin that April morning of 1810, did not know what to expect of the new life before him. He had held the bridle of Mr. Toppin's mare and noticed how carefully the big man threw his leg over the saddle with its bag of brushes and paints. Then he flung his thin leg over the gray one's back and settled himself into the saddle that still creaked from the newness. Mr. Toppin had doffed his wide-brimmed hat, and Jared had waved to Eben and Nancy, standing on the doorstone, to Thankful and Mary, clinging to Nancy's skirts, and to the babe in her arms. Then they had turned their horses' heads toward the road and started off. In the last glance, Jared saw the twisted shapes of the apple trees before the house. Over the hill he saw a thin spiral of smoke from the Thaxter's chimney. Those things were home, and his heart felt a pang of longing at leaving them. But he had learned early to steel himself against bodily pain, and that of the heart was little different. So he turned his eyes to the road ahead and to the uneven line of the mountains that rose up against the sky. Always the mountains had bound his world, the distant blue ones to the north, the pyramid-shaped one that reared itself high in lonely splendor to the west, and the tapering line to the east that rose up from near their own land. When he was a little boy, he had thought that the mountains rimmed the world, and beyond them there was nothing else. Later, when he had had a few months of school, he learned that the rest of the world lay beyond the mountains, some of it evil, some of it good. Mr. Toppin and Jared rode through the pass over the mountains. When they stood still for a moment on the crest to rest their horses, Jared could see both the road behind them, reaching back into the known world, and the road ahead. The wind whistled through the gap, and he shivered. "Are you afeard, boy?" Mr. Toppin asked kindly. "Are you wanting to turn back?" Jared felt the pull of the road they had traveled over and all the things that it led back to. Mother Thaxter's warm kitchen, and Jeanette in her blue dress. Nancy's kindness and her attempts to make up for Eben's anger. The little girls and the baby. Then the long years of planting and harvesting, wintering and planting again, and a boy growing to be a farmer like his father, looking out to the mountains and always wondering what lay beyond them. "No, Mr. Toppin, I'm not fearful, just full of wondering. I like the looks of the road ahead." "So be it, then." Mr. Toppin pressed his mare forward, and the gray one drew into her stride obediently. "But mark you, boy, since you have chosen one road, follow it with your whole heart. From this time forth we speak no more of the farms on the backside of the mountain. The Lord did not give me a good pair of eyes for nothing, and with but one of them I could see well enough what your life has been and what it could be. You've a gift in your fingers which God can use, but lay yourself open for the work, and think of the past only when that quietness comes which can soothe the sharp edges of memory." "Yes, Mr. Toppin." Jared found it easier to say that now that they were going down the other side of the mountain. "For 5 years you'll be my apprentice," Mr. Toppin went on. "And 5 years from the 12th day of April, 1810, you can mount this same road and return to your people. You'll be your own master then, and no man can lift a hand to you, save to pay you well for your services." What if I would work for you more than 5 years, Mr. Toppin?" 5 years is long enough for any man to serve another when he has the gift I think you have." They rode on in silence. The sun climbed high in the sky, and its warmth was lavished on the earth. Warblers sang in the trees edging the road, and a brook recently loosed from the winter's lock of ice and snow raced over boulders in its course to the valley. Often a deer sprang across the path before them, and more than once the underbrush moved heavily where a bear, paddling along and sniffing the ground, had stepped aside to let them pass. "A journeyman painter's life is not an easy one, Jared," Mr. Toppin was saying. "We're here 1 week, and there another. Sometimes we get no pay but our board, and sometimes we get no thanks. But it's a good life, too." Do you know what their board means?
What? Their stay?
Yeah, like
The food.
to be able to sleep and eat at someone's house. It must be a fine thing to use those big brushes that you have in your saddlebag, Jared commented. You shall see soon enough, for we've a room to do at an inn ahead of us on the road. If the gray one can do her 30 miles as well as my mare, we'll be there by nightfall and at work in the morning. Jared, stumbling for words in his joy, found only an apology. But Mr. Toppin, I've never used a brush. I can teach you, boy, and learning comes best by doing. They had been traveling 3 hours or more, sometimes in silence, sometimes in talk, when Mr. Toppin reined in his horse by a ford. There was a clearing and some fallen logs to sit on, new greening grass for the horses to graze, and the brook for them all to drink from. We won't be the first travelers to stop here for our luncheon, Mr. Toppin commented as he slipped the bridle from his horse. Then he stretched his booted legs out on the ground with his back against the tree. Its smooth bark was a bulletin board of initials carved intricately and laboriously, while other horses had been grazing and other travelers resting. The brown mare stepped into the brook and drank deeply by the water. Jared, still keeping his hand on the gray one's reins, let her water beside the mare. Then he led her over to the grassy spot. She's a young thing still, Mr. Toppin, and I'll not let her loose this first day, Jared explained. 'Twould do me no good if she took a fancy into her head to go back over the mountain to her own pasture. Mr. Toppin smiled. That's right, Jared. Keep a good eye on your horse, for a horse is a journeyman's partner in business. He took from his pocket a package of bread and cheese which Nancy Austin had given him that morning. Jared secured the gray one to a log and went upstream, above where the horses had been drinking, to get fresh water in a flat bottle Mr. Toppin carried in his pack. Returning, he sat on the fallen log near Mr. Toppin, breaking bread together, drinking cold forest-drawn water out of the same bottle, with 2 horses cropping grass nearby and birds singing in the sweet April air, made Jared feel that the windows of heaven had opened to him. Has the brown mare been your partner long, Mr. Toppin? He asked. Yes, for many a long year we've gone seeking work together, he answered, and she's done more for me than my brushes have. Mr. Toppin looked at Jared. Bless you, boy, you haven't lived as much as half the time we've been traveling, yet how the world has changed. When I first took to the road, I was willing enough to do any job that came my way, a piece of carpentering here or painting there with my board as my wage. In those days there wasn't time or inclination for aught but things needed. Was the traveling hard then? Mr. Toppin nodded. The roads through the forest were mere trails, and sometimes you had to hold your eyes close to the slashes on the trees to keep from straying. Many of the farms were just clearings with the stumps still standing in the fields, and there were more log cabins than houses. A man like me carried a gun as well as a pack then. Did you meet with Indians often? No, Mr. Toppin said with a shake of his head. Bears and wolverines were the most troublesome, but I stayed in many a cabin with old folk who had tales to tell of the Indians, of homes burned to the ground and women and children carried off to be sold to the French in Canada. But that's all a story of the past, and so is the war which gave us the liberty we've yet to show we can use as well. He sighed. It's so far behind us that it looks as if we might have to fight another war on the sea this time. What is it all for, Mr. Toppin? I'm not the best to explain, boy, but when you win one battle, you often have to prove you knew what you were fighting for and win the next. I've been in the North Country all winter and have heard little enough news. Tonight at the inn, we'll fill our ears right enough. Jared's tongue was trembling with questions he longed to ask, but Mr. Toppin had closed his eyes and folded his hands over his broad chest. Jared reined the gray one near him and stroked her soft nose. All around them was the forest-tall trees, breaking into new foliage, silent depths which never man had trod, which knew no sound save the stealthy feet of Indians and the quick flight of wild things. But it was the same forest that man was pushing back, making clearings in, raising homes, And after the work had gone well, he sought to bring beauty into those homes, taking his patterns from the careless tracery in nature and with infinite care, reproducing them. Thinking back, as Mr. Toppin had said he could do in quietness, to the home beyond the mountains, Jared saw the rough edges blurred with happiness. There was his father giving him the gray one, Nancy Austin with her eyes shining like stars out of the darkness of the loft, telling him of his apprenticeship, Janet coming back from feeding the chickens, the April wind tossing her hair. A few days ago, Jared had come upon a spring bubbling in a field, the water reaching up from the earth, tumbling onward in a cool stream. The natural joy at the heart of all creation was like that spring, he thought, bubbling from dark depths and, once released, impatient to water the earth. The brown mare had been standing at rest with sagging head and drooping tail. Now, as if at a signal, she raised her head, stiffened her tail, and moved a pace or two until she could push her nose against her master's face. Mr. Toppin stirred and opened his eyes. "All right, girl," he said drowsily. He sat up, and seeing Jared sitting opposite him, explained, "She never lets me sleep more than an hour when we're on our way." They had soon tightened their saddle girths and mounted, riding on through the green stillness. Every mile was like the last, for the woods did not terminate, and the road was rutted and rocky. By mid-afternoon they had come into a different countryside, and the forest hung behind them like a curtain of green let down over the world. They were in Massachusetts now, and the road had widened so that two carts could have passed each other in safety. There were meadows and pastures surrounding them, and rich fields where the earth had been newly broken by the plow and was being planted. They had passed a farmhouse every few miles, with sheep and cattle in the pastures and horses working the fields, such a sight to Jared after the great lumbering oxen even Austin had worked his land with. They passed more people on the road, sometimes overtaking a cart heavily laden with farm produce, seeking its slow way to market, sometimes joining a fellow journeyman with whom they would ride for a while, exchanging news. Mr. Toppin waved to a tin peddler, resting his horse by the roadside, and the brief greeting was capped by the phrase, "I'll see you at Cinnamon John's tonight." "Do you know everyone in the world, Mr. Toppin?" Jared asked, marveling at the greetings given along the way. Mr. Toppin laughed. "Not a mite of them, boy. But we often meet on the road, and some of us will be sitting around Cinnamon John's table tonight." "Is that the inn where we've a room to do?" "It is, and everyone calls its keeper Cinnamon John." "Why, Mr. Toppin?" "Why, because he sailed on one of the first ships that went to the Indies, and no one in these parts had ever tasted cinnamon until John brought some back with him." Wow, can you imagine not ever having tasted cinnamon?
No.
It was near dusk when they approached the inn. It stood at a crossroads with an ample barn close to the road and beside the inn, a trough where travelers could water their horses and splash some of the dust of the road off their own hands and faces. Mr. Toppin reined up at the door and was greeted with a hearty "hallo" from within. Then the door was opened and Cinnamon John came out. He was a thick-set, grizzly man with a smile as broad as his well-filled paunch. Do you know what that is? A paunch?
I can make my paunch. Do I see?
"Toppin, I've been looking for you for a month," he called out. John said I'd be here when the snow was off the roads. "Oh, John, I said I'd be here when the snow is off the roads." "Snow?" John roared. "We've not seen a flick of it here for 6 weeks. I've come down from the North Country, and it's but recently cleared off up there." Mr. Toppin dismounted by the door, and Cinnamon John clapped him on the shoulders. Jared slid off the gray one and held the reins of both horses. Cinnamon John cocked an eye at him. "Who's the lad?" he asked. "My apprentice, John," Mr. Toppin answered with a note of pride in his voice, "and we'll start on your job tomorrow if you've got some milk set for me." "Oh, there's always milk enough," John said. "But don't they feed children any better in the North?" He ran his eye over Jared's bony body. Always heard the land was poorly, but he's the runtiest bit of a boy I've ever seen. Oh, he's a good one. How do you think you'd feel if someone said that about you? That you were the runtiest bit of a boy they'd ever seen?
I don't feel good.
No.
What the rentiest?
The runt is like the smallest pup in a litter. He's a good one, Mr. Toppin said with a laugh. Then he turned to Jared. Put the horses in the barn, boy, and come in when you've settled them. The two men disappeared into the inn, and Jared led the horses to the barn. There were bedded stalls waiting. He unsaddled the mares and rubbed them down well with handfuls of hay, then threw blankets over them. They had gone well. The brown mare because she knew her job, the gray because she was young and high-spirited, but they were both tired and drooped their heads wearily into their mangers. Jared set the saddles carefully against the wall, going from the barn to the inn. He stopped at the trough to splash himself clean with cold water. The lights of the inn gleamed out warmly against the approach of the night. There were a clatter of dishes and savory smells coming from the kitchen. Fragrant smoke billowed out of the huge chimney. Other travelers were arriving in carriages on foot, on horseback, leading their tired animals into the barn, then opening the door of the inn and disappearing into the light and warmth within. Jared stood by the trough, quivering with happiness. He wanted to watch the door of the inn open and shut many times. He wanted to go on thinking of the wonders that lay across its threshold, for he knew that his first step into that world beyond the door would be his first step into manhood. He squared his shoulders. Holding his head high, he went toward the wide and welcoming door. Inside, there was a hubbub of voices, the flickering of candlelight, the movement of shadows on the walls, the enticing smell of food ready to be served. There was a fire on the wide hearth, and black kettles simmering over it, and on the table a roast stood ready to be carved. It's like a piece of meat. One long table ran the length of the room, its bare surface shining with the gleam of pewter plates and tankards. Benches ranged on either side of the table, each with room for a dozen or more people. At a word from Cinnamon John, the men moved toward their places, and Jared slipped in among them beside Mr. Toppin. The benches were drawn up, and Cinnamon John sank his carving knife into the roast. It was good, that dinner, and the men ate heartily. When the empty platter that had held the roast was removed, Cinnamon John's wife opened the door of the brick oven and brought out a pudding, browned to perfection, with an aroma all its own rising from it in tantalizing, invisible spirals. Jared did not need to ask any questions, though he had never met such a fragrance before. This was the spice that had made the inn famous up and down the countryside. They're talking about the cinnamon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talk that was loud and free and jovial resounded in the room, but it was not until people had been fed, the table cleared, and the dishes removed for washing that the men gave themselves to talk in earnest. Most of the travelers had been wintering or working in the north and were starved for news of the world. Cinnamon John had some to share, and a tinker, newly arrived from Boston, had the most to give. James Madison had rounded out his first year of the presidency with little distinction. He was desirous, as Jefferson had been before him, to keep peace, and by the diplomatic means at his disposal, he had, so far, kept trade open with Great Britain. But Napoleon was rapidly making matters worse by seizing all the American vessels he could lay hold on. "A trap it is to embroil us with England," Cinnamon John exclaimed angrily, while a murmur of assent rolled over the group. "When Bonaparte is finally imprisoned and the world at peace," Mr. Toppin injected, "what, I ask you, will the papers fill their columns with?" "Aye, that's the question," the tinker reflected. "Talk or write, as one would these days, the main hinge was always Napoleon Bonaparte." So much for foreign affairs. but those at home were curiously influenced by those abroad. It was difficult to talk of one without coming back to the other. The Northwest was opening swiftly, and already New England men were being tempted from their stubborn land. There was rich soil awaiting them in new states being carved from territory that had been lately acquired from the Indians, sometimes honorably, sometimes shamefully, and often through open warfare. In spite of rocks and shallows, the tide of emigration would soon mark the first half of the century. The tide of emigration which would mark the first half of the century had already begun to flow, and the face of New England was changing. Where farms had been, factories were springing up. Clocks, chairs, textiles, and notions of all kinds were being manufactured, and peddlers were carrying them into the South and the West. The young country, as the knowledgeable tinker from Boston went on to explain, was like a nut in a cracker, with clashes on the high seas making one pinch and clashes on the frontier the other, both branching from the same stem. Jefferson might have extricated the meat of the nut without having it broken when the shell was crushed, but could Madison? That was the question asked by many. Jared listened until his head nodded with sleep, and Mr. Toppin suddenly remembered that the young boy should have been sent to the loft hours ago. "The coming industry can't harm our trade," he commented, as he watched Jared slowly mounting the stairs, but 'twill tend to heighten it. The next morning early, the various travelers who had stopped overnight began to take their leave. There was a tramping of booted feet on the kitchen floor, the sound of voices, and the clinking of coins as payment was made to Cinnamon John, sometimes in cash, more often in other things. Money was scarce in those days, and an innkeeper was glad to settle accounts with a bushel of apples or sack of wool, some labor, a few needed notions from a peddler, or heavier stuff from a team going to the markets. There was a stamping and neighing in the barn as horses were saddled or harnessed, and a calling back and forth as men got under way. By 7 o'clock, only Mr. Toppin and Jared were left at the long table by the deep fireplace, and Mr. Toppin had pushed his plate away and was beginning to make rough sketches on a piece of paper. "Jared, did you see to the horses?" "Yes, Mr. Toppin. I fed and watered them an hour ago." "And my saddlebags?" "I'll fetch them." Jared darted from the room. When he returned with the bags and their precious freight of brushes and paint powders, Cinnamon John and Mr. Toppin were deep in a discussion of the designs for the large room on the second floor of the inn, the length of which ran across the entire front of the house. Although there were fireplaces at either end and windows well spaced, the walls of the room were bare, and the grayish-white plaster had a ghostly look. Cinnamon John stood in the center of the room. "It should be the brightest room in the house, a place where I can gather all my friends together. But it looks like the inside of a tomb. What can you do about it, Toppin?" Mr. Toppin looked at the innkeeper. "John, what means most to you in this life?" he asked. "Mind, I'm not asking you to mention your wife or your family, or that powerful stallion you've got in the barn, or the porker you're fattening. But what do you like to remember?" John scratched his grizzled head. Then he said slowly, "I like to remember the East, the spicy smell of it, the sun shining on the dark skins of the people, the birds with their fancy plumes, and the odd fruit hanging on the trees. I'm a landlocked sailor, Toppin, and I've got an inn instead of a ship. But if I could have one wish, it would be to sail around the Horn again before I die." He laughed his loud, roistering laugh. "But man, that's got naught to do with these white walls." Mr. Toppin nodded his head slowly. "John, do you trust me? Will you let me go my way with these walls, and will you keep below until I've finished?" John narrowed his eyes. "I wouldn't do it with anyone else in the world, but I will with you, Toppin." He turned on his heel and started toward the door. Then he looked back for a moment. "While you're here, the best that Cinnamon John has to give you will be yours, and If I can't put some flesh on that scrawny runt, I've no business keeping an inn." Mr. Toppin smiled, and an embarrassed smile broke over Jared's face. "There are firkins of milk in the shed for you," Cinnamon John said. "How long do you plan to be doing the room?" "A month or more, John." "Then I'll turn your horse out to pasture. And remember," he wagged one of his thick round fingers at Mr. Toppin, "if I like your work, you'll have 20 silver dollars." He turned and left the room. Wow.
That's a lot of money.
Jared faced Mr. Toppin. "And if he doesn't like it?" "We'll have no more of that on our board," Mr. Toppin said we'll have no more than our board," Mr. Toppin said shortly. "But none of that now, for I don't begin a job thinking that it won't be liked. Know your man, Jared Austin, before you undertake his work, and you'll do it so it will please him." They were the first words of many that the master was to say to his apprentice, and Jared would remember them always. Now things began to happen quickly as Jared worked with Mr. Toppin. A wide plank was set on trestles to serve as a table. The saddlebags were unpacked and their precious contents stood forth, a series of brushes of varying shapes and sizes, several packets containing dry colors, green, ochre, blue, brown, yellow, and Venetian red. There were measuring tools, a cord, and some chalk. There were blocks of wood with designs stamped on them and sheets of heavy paper, some plain, some with designs already cut on them. An exclamation of joy came from Jared as he saw the stencils, for they were what he had been striving for when he had cut a clumsy design on the leaf. "Now, boy, fetch the milk from the buttery and 2 or 3 wooden buckets that are hanging there for us. Then all will be in readiness." I wonder what he's going to use the milk for.
For mixing the paint with, to make it a lighter color. And to make the paint watery because it's just,
Powder.
yeah.
When Jared returned with the firkins of nicely soured milk, and later with the empty buckets, Mr. Toppin was standing in the middle of the room, looking at the walls. A smile was stealing over his face, and Jared knew that Mr. Toppin was not seeing the bare walls, but the decorated ones. Jared felt that perhaps his first lesson as an apprentice was to learn not to ask questions, but to wait, and when his master spoke, to listen. So he tucked his legs under him on the bench running along the wall and waited, wondering if, after he had been with Mr. Toppin a while, he too would see the finished work before a brush had so much as lifted or a stencil held to the wall. Often he had tried to make what he was dimly seeing in his mind come before his eyes, with a cinder on the hearth, or with a leaf upon a stone. Now he began to see that it must be clear in his own mind first, before he attempted to fashion it. Then it would find its imprint quickly, through whatever medium he chose. Mr. Toppin went over to the firkins of milk. He put his finger into the firming mass and tasted it, then nodded. "It's soured to the turn we want," he said. Taking a packet of ochre powder, he poured its contents into the milk, mixing it round and round with a wooden ladle. It looked as if the burning amber of a sunset had been scooped into a wooden bucket. "It's strong, lad, but when it dries on the wall, it will be the color we want. Always mix your washes darker than you want them, for they dry that much lighter." He took the widest and flattest of his brushes, dipped it carefully into the bucket, and showed Jared how the color was to be washed on the walls. "Am I to do that, Mr. Toppin?" Jared asked, scarcely believing that such a trust was his. Mr. Toppin nodded. "Go lightly, evenly. You may be at it all day while I'm busy at the stencils." So I think what he's doing is first coloring, putting a solid color down onto the wall before they do the stenciling over the top.
Yeah.
There were a few further instructions which, to Jared, seemed like a song set to the music in his heart. Then he dipped the brush and climbed up the small ladder to the ceiling and began sweeping the color down to the floor in clean, even strokes. The walls looked far too vivid for beauty when they were wet. But as the wash dried, The color softened. Jared gazed with pleasure at the warmth with which the room had begun to glow. Mr. Toppin, meanwhile, worked at cutting his stencils. On stiff paper, he first tried his design, then, taking a sharp knife which was constantly being resharpened on a small whetstone, he cut the stencils out. Often the edges of the pattern were beveled so that they would lie with perfect smoothness when applied to the walls, and so provide a sharp outline to the design. Intricate and many were the stencils that lay cut and ready for use. Jared longed to watch Mr. Toppin cutting, but though few words had been exchanged between them, he knew that his job was to apply the background color for the stencils. If he did that well, someday he would be taught how to cut stencils with a knife as sharp and shiny as Mr. Toppin's own. It's a simple tool, Mr. Toppin said once, holding a stencil up to the light to see it more clearly, but it's served the world well through many ages. And there's nothing fancy about it, for stenciling is as homespun a craft as weaving. Take what you know. The way a woman takes the wool from her sheep and spins it for her loom, take the colors God has given us in the earth and sky and flowering things, then use the good sense that's your heritage. Will it always be beautiful, Mr. Toppin? Yes, he answered with conviction, if you keep true to your own feeling for beauty. Some may call it dainty, some may call it daring, but none will call it aught but beautiful. What do you mean by keeping true? Jared asked, laying down his brush to rest his arm. Mr. Toppin looked at him until his eyes seemed not to see the boy Jared, but the man Jared might become. Then he said quietly, It's letting God have your life, so that your hands do the work he wants you to do. You've begun rightly, Jared, for that's the beginning and end of all my teaching. They worked until dusk. Buckets of paint were empty. Jared's arm ached from its day-long drawing of the brush from ceiling to floor. He laid the brush down, his fingers trembling as his arm hung limp at his side. Mr. Toppin smiled at the pile of cut stencils. The room was darkening quickly, but it was darkening in shades of gold, colors of the sunset, still warm, though light had gone. Mr. Toppin nodded his head. It's good, he said. He scanned the ceiling, but not a brush stroke marred the plaster. His eyes swept the floor, but found no splash of paint or careless drop to fasten on. In fact, it's well done, he said slowly. Perhaps I made a good choice when I hired you from your father, yes? Jared was too tired to do anything but smile, and the room was too dark by then to reveal the full meaning of his smile.